This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on US-Iran nuclear standoff and its implication. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist.
Today we are talking about efforts between the United States and Iran to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal, negotiated and signed initially in 2015 between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the United Nations and Germany. To throw light on the implications of these renewed discussions, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, on April the 6th, the United States joined talks in Vienna which were aimed at reviving the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which President Trump had withdrawn from in 2018. Now, since President Joe Biden has said he wants to return to this landmark accord, both Iran and the United States are trying to find their way to return to the agreed limits. Iran has said it will not meet the United States face-to-face till that happens. So now officials from the United Kingdom, France and Germany have been acting as intermediaries. Diplomats from Russia and China also attended discussions, and on 9th April, a joint commission meeting of the JCPOA members was held in Vienna, and the meeting followed a virtual and in-person meeting, and they have agreed to look at the US sanctions that were imposed on Iran, and another working group will develop conditions that Iran has to comply with to execute the JCPOA. So while it would appear that an important beginning has been made, it will take time and effort for both countries to revive the trust factor lost by the Trump administration's actions. What do you think, sir, are the implications of these talks for the region?
Nilova, I think I'll begin by saying that, there is a desire on the part of Iran as well as the United States to make a breakthrough. But of course, they both want it on their terms. And in the case of Iran, it's particularly important for the current government and the president, which is Hassan Rouhani, not to be seen as weak because the elections are coming up in Iran in June. So obviously, they would like to at least show the people that they have stood up to the United States. And that's why the stance has so far been that the United States must lift its sanctions, which were imposed during the Trump administration. In fact, reinforced during the Trump administration in 2019. And now there are something like 1,600 of these sanctions which need to be considered. So that's the first issue. Second issue is that as far as the United States is concerned, Biden has clearly said that it would not be the United States which will blink first. It will be the Iranians who will need to comply and go back to the compliance mechanism which was set up in the JCPOA, which they have gone back on under circumstances which they said was actually not fair to them and that the others had not complied with the agreement. So both have a point there, and what will happen in these talks would be that there would be a role which will be played by the group which has been set up, which is obviously the group which also brought about the JCPOA, led by the European Union and plus the 5 other countries, who would go back and forth. They would meet the Iranians in the room. The Iranians would give their proposals. They would then talk to the United States in a separate room, or the United States delegation will come in when the Iranians leave. And thereafter, if there is an agreement which is reached in some form in which they can both accommodate each other, then there would be the setting of the working group. At that stage, everybody expects that the working group comprised of representatives at the official level of the United States and Iran, who would then be talking to each other and hammering out the technical part of the agreement. But the U.S. Point of view seems to be, and I think they would strive for that, is to reach an agreement before June elections so as to bind down the new administration, the new dispensation in Iran to this particular agreement.
Anil, Israel or somebody seems to have complicated matters even further in all of this, because somebody has targeted the nuclear facility at Natanz in Iran last week. The Iranians are accusing Israel, and the U.S. Secretary of Defense, in fact, Lloyd Austin, visited Israel last week. So Iran is even suggesting that perhaps the United States had something to do with this. So is this kind of atmosphere of complete lack of trust, for want of a better word, is this going to really hamper things, do you think? I mean, how can these kinds of issues be resolved?
So I think as far as Israel is concerned, it's been a one-point agenda to try and sabotage these talks because the Israelis are very clear that if there is any sort of agreement which is reached in Iran, even if it is limiting the kind of actions that they can take for enrichment, the eventual aim of Iran, according to them, is to go nuclear. And they have impressed upon the previous administration of the United States, the Trump administration, that this was actually the aim of the Iranians and that they should not fall for it. And that's what actually led to President Trump pulling out of this agreement in 2018. The current administration in the United States is more flexible. It feels that there could be improvements, perhaps, which could be brought about in the 2015 agreement. And Trump administration had actually tried to extend this also to the missile facilities and to missiles in the possession of Iran. It seems to be a non-starter, and this administration, of course, is not so far pronounced itself on that. So as long as the old JCPOA is stuck to, I believe that there is room for reaching an agreement.
In the meanwhile, also China, having signed this fairly comprehensive economic and defense deal with Iran, whereby for the next 20 odd years, they're going to put in a great deal of money, about $400 billion, and revive the Iranian oil sector that requires funding desperately. So now, again, in that kind of a scenario, doesn't it become less important for a country like Iran to actually comply with a lot of the issues that the United States wants them to comply with?
Nilova, I would not pay too much of credence to that agreement because that's been talked about in the past. There is nothing definitive about the sum of $400 billion over 25 years. And it's not been spelled out in those terms in the agreement that has been signed. That is, now subsequently the writings that have come out have all stressed upon the fact that it remains a vague agreement. In fact, the Iranians would much rather prefer if they could deal with the Europeans and the Americans eventually directly rather than just relying on the Chinese, because the Chinese presence has grown in Iran and, obviously Iran would like to diversify. Their aim is actually to be able to talk directly eventually to the United States and also to be able to pursue what they call the peaceful nuclear program. So as long as this agreement is not revived, they will not be able to do that. So therefore, I think that's a factor, but a very small factor. And, obviously, the Iranians themselves feel that is not adequate.
Now, given that and the fact that, oil prices the world over again are in a fair deal of turmoil, what with the pandemic and so on, how does an agreement say if the JCPOA is revived, how will it affect India, for example? And I mean, the broader region, of course, but also India. India would have certain stakes as well, wouldn't it?
Definitely. I think India will be affected in many ways. Mostly, I would say that it will have a beneficial effect on India if the JCPOA is revised. Why? Because first of all, it will allow India to import more from Iran as far as its energy imports are concerned. So oil, imports from Iran would definitely go up because the kind of oil which Iranian, oil fields have, the Indian refiners much rather prefer that. That's one. Secondly, in terms of security, don't forget that Iran was an important partner of Russia and India as far as the Taliban were concerned in Afghanistan. That issue is hotting up again. And if India is able to deal with Iran directly on that issue, it would be very pleased if that can happen. Thirdly, it's a question of, the opportunities which will arise for India vis-a-vis China, because at the moment it's only the Chinese companies who are operating in Iran. India is not doing that because of the threat of sanctions, even though they're not recognized by the United Nations. But then you have companies like China National Petroleum Corporation who made deep inroads into Iran at the moment. That will continue to grow if JCPOA is not revived. Fourthly is question of Pakistan, where Pakistan would gain from the Chinese push into Iran. That has implications for India as well. And the extension of OBOR into Iran would not be a good development for India. Fifthly is the question of the energy security. and also connectivity plans that India has for Central Asia via Chabahar for the North-South Transport Corridor, etc., and connectivity into Afghanistan through Chabahar again. So Indian investments into Chabahar, cannot proceed unhindered as long as the JCPOA sanctions are not lifted.
Right.
And finally, of course, there is the question of, I would also talk a little bit about the, conversely, the non-beneficial effect, which would be that Iran would drive a hard bargain in future with India, as it has other countries which will, suddenly pay their attention into Iran, especially the Europeans, as far as investments into gas fields, oil fields are concerned. Secondly, the question of Indian companies. How many of the Indian companies will be able to trade and invest in Iran in food, pharmaceuticals, transportation services, banking, information technology, and construction? So Iran is a big market, and all these countries would look for the same piece of the cake, and that would make competition that much difficult.
Anil, the French Foreign Minister, Mr. Jean-Yves Le Drian, is coming tomorrow, April 13th, to meet with the External Affairs Minister here. And in those talks, it's almost certain that he will be briefing his Indian counterpart in terms of whatever little progress there has been or hasn't been in these indirect US-Iran negotiations. Do you think to that extent India can try and get its point across and say, make some suggestions there?
Yes, certainly. I think what India is looking for, as long as the JCPOA is not revived, and I think it's going to take some time before it's revived. It might even spill over after the elections in Iran in June, in which case India's plans for Chabahar, they will not be able to be fructified. So what India would like is to, continue that sanctions from the United States should not apply to the question of Chabahar, because of the connectivity issue and the fact that it affects Afghanistan directly, and at the same time the connectivity that India wants to create with Central Asia. So that's the point that India will make. Secondly, it will make the point that it has already invested a lot into Chabahar, and those investments should not go to waste, that these should be realized, and India is in the process of actually supplying more equipment to Chabahar and also to construct the connectivity road links into Afghanistan at the moment. So India would like them to continue, even though we will not be able to import oil to the extent that we were importing earlier. But at least the connectivity part of it, strategically, United States seems to understand that point as well.
So all in all, it is a fairly difficult kind of a situation at this point, and how this develops, and particularly those elections in June in Iran are going to determine a whole lot of activities which have a very direct bearing on India, wouldn't you say?
Actually, what has happened also internationally is that the International Atomic Energy Agency has got just 3 months in which it has to inspect the facilities in Iran. So Iranians also are playing, the pressure game through the international community, and of course they might extend it and later on say that we can do it for another 3 months, provided they see light at the end of the tunnel and they feel that there is a headway being made with the United States. But as I said, the elections would be an important marker for both the ruling dispensation and the opposition in Iran. I see it not being resolving, till the elections are over. But let's hope that it does, so that it has a beneficial effect on India.
So it's something that we will need to be watching very clearly. Thank you so very much, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa.
Thank you so much.
You are listening to a discussion on US-Iran nuclear standoff and its implication. The participants were Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our website, newsonair.com. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.